During an asthma attack, two young bullies snatched a veteran's inhaler, assuming no one would dare step in. But they had no idea the royal guard had been observing the whole time. What happened next left the entire crowd speechless. Here's how it all played out. Before we dive in, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe because tomorrow, at the same time, we'll share another powerful story of discipline and bravery from the royal guards you won't want to miss. On a crisp autumn morning in October 2023, the golden leaves of London's ancient plane trees danced in the wind around Buckingham Palace. The morning sun cast long shadows across the iconic black and gold gates, where tourists gathered with cameras raised, hoping to catch a glimpse of the legendary royal guards in their scarlet tunics and towering burskin hats. Among these silent sentinels stood Corporal James Ashford, a man whose military bearing spoke of years of service that extended far beyond the ceremonial duties he now performed. At 32, Ashford had already completed 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Grenadier Guards before earning his position at the palace. His steely gray eyes, hidden beneath the shadow of his burskin hat, constantly scanned the crowd with the trained vigilance of a soldier who had learned that danger could emerge from the most unexpected places. The morning had begun like any other. Tourists snapped photos, children pointed in wonder at the motionless guards, and the usual stream of London traffic hummed beyond the palace gates. But as Ashford maintained his rigid posture, his peripheral vision caught something that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Near the Victoria Memorial, about 50 meters from his post, an elderly man sat heavily on a park bench. The man was well dressed in a navy blue blazer, and even from a distance, Ashford could see the glint of military medals pinned to his chest. What caught the guard's attention, however, was the man's labored breathing and the way he clutched at his chest with trembling hands. Jonathan Cooper, though Ashford didn't know his name yet, was a 65-year-old retired RAF squadron leader who had served his country with distinction during the Falklands War in 1982. The medals on his chest told a story of heroism that few would ever fully understand. The Distinguished Flying Cross, the South Atlantic Medal, and the General Service Medal with clasp for Northern Ireland. But on this particular morning, Cooper's war story seemed far away as he struggled with the onset of a severe asthma attack. The asthma had been a constant companion since the Falklands. On May 21, 1982, then Flight Lieutenant Cooper had been flying a Harrier GR-3 on a ground attack mission against Argentine positions on Goose Green when his aircraft was hit by small arms fire. The emergency ejection had saved his life, but the smoke inhalation from the burning aircraft and the shock of the South Atlantic's frigid waters had damaged his lungs permanently. For decades, he had managed the condition with medication and regular checkups, but stress and cold weather could still trigger severe attacks. As Cooper fumbled in his jacket pocket for his reliever inhaler, his breathing became increasingly labored. The familiar tightness in his chest was building, and he could feel panic beginning to set in a dangerous cycle that would only make the attack worse. His hands shook as he brought the blue inhaler to his lips, but before he could take the life-saving medication, a shadow fell across the bench. 2 young men approached, their swagger and predatory grins immediately setting off alarm bells in Ashford's mind. Greg Williamson, 23, and Danny Morrison, 25, were no strangers to trouble. Unknown to Cooper, both had extensive criminal records spanning theft, assault, and harassment. They had been prowling the tourist areas around the palace for weeks, looking for easy targets to rob or intimidate. Greg, the taller of the two with a spider web tattoo creeping up his neck, spotted the elderly man's distress and saw opportunity. "Look at this old geezer," he whispered to Danny, loud enough for Cooper to hear. "Looks like he's having a bit of trouble breathing." Danny, stockier and with gold teeth that glinted when he smiled, laughed cruelly. "Maybe we should help him out," he said, the menace in his voice unmistakable. Cooper looked up at them, his eyes wide with a combination of fear and the desperate need for air. He tried to stand, but his legs were weak, and the lack of oxygen was making him dizzy. The inhaler trembled in his hand as he attempted to use it, but Greg was quicker. "What's this then?" Greg snatched the inhaler from Cooper's grasp with lightning speed. "Some kind of drug. Old man's got himself a little habit," as he'd from his post. Ashford watched the scene unfold with growing tension. His training as a royal guard demanded that he remain motionless, focused on his ceremonial duties. But his training as a soldier, a real soldier, who had fought in real wars, demanded something entirely different. The conflict between duty and conscience played out in the barely perceptible tightening of his grip on his rifle. Cooper's condition was deteriorating rapidly. The classic signs of a severe asthma attack were becoming more pronounced with each passing second. His lips were beginning to turn blue from lack of oxygen. His speech was reduced to gasping attempts at words, and his chest was heaving with the effort of trying to draw air into constricted airways. "Please," Cooper managed to gasp, his voice barely a whisper. "Need inhaler." "Served, Falklands." Greg held the inhaler up, examining it with mock curiosity. "Oh, you're a war hero, are you? Think that makes you special?" He tossed the device casually to Danny, who caught it with a grin. The mention of the Falklands sent a chill through Ashford. His own grandfather had served in that conflict, and the stories of courage and sacrifice in those distant islands had been part of his family's military heritage. But more than that, he could see that Cooper wasn't just an old man having a medical emergency. He was a brother in arms, a fellow soldier who had put his life on the line for his country. Danny began tossing the inhaler back and forth between his hands, just out of Cooper's reach. "Come on then, old soldier," he taunted. "Show us what you've got. Maybe if you crawl for it, we'll give it back." The crowd of tourists was beginning to notice the commotion. Some pointed and whispered, others took out their phones to record what they initially thought might be some kind of street performance. But as Cooper's distress became more obvious, the mood began to shift from curiosity to concern. A middle-aged woman from Germany approached hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said to Greg in accented English. "I think this man needs help. Should we call an ambulance?" Greg whirled on her, his face contorting with anger. "Mind your own business, love. This is between us and Grandpa here." The woman backed away, frightened by the young man's aggression, but she pulled out her phone and began dialing. Others in the crowd were doing the same, but Cooper didn't have time to wait for help to arrive. His breathing was becoming so labored that he could barely stay conscious. Ashford's training had taught him to assess threats quickly and accurately. What he saw before him wasn't just harassment, it was potentially manslaughter. If Cooper didn't get his medication soon, he could die, and these two criminals would be responsible. The ceremonial duties of a royal guard suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the life or death situation unfolding just meters away. The situation escalated when Cooper tried to stand and reach for his inhaler. His legs gave out, and he collapsed to one knee, his face now distinctly blue around the lips. The sight triggered something primal in Greg, who saw vulnerability as an invitation to cruelty. "Look at him," Greg laughed, kicking Cooper's walking cane away so it clattered across the pavement. "The great war hero can't even stand up. What kind of soldier are you?" Danny joined in, dancing around Cooper with the inhaler held high above his head. "Maybe if you tell us about all the people you killed, we'll give it back. Come on, war criminal. Spill your guts." The accusation hit Cooper like a physical blow. His military service had been a source of pride his entire life, and to have it twisted into something shameful by these thugs was almost as suffocating as his failing lungs. He thought of his squadron mates who hadn't made it home from the Falklands, of the Argentine pilots who had died in aerial combat, of the terrible waste of war that haunted his dreams. "I saved lives," Cooper wheezed, his voice barely audible. This was true. During the Falklands conflict, Cooper had not only flown ground attack missions, but had also participated in search and rescue operations, saving downed pilots from both sides of the conflict. After the war, he had become an advocate for veterans' mental health, helping dozens of former servicemen deal with PTSD and other war-related trauma. But Greg and Danny weren't interested in heroism or service. They were interested in power, in the rush that came from dominating someone weaker than themselves. Greg leaned down, his face inches from Cooper's, and sneered, "Save lives. You're about to lose yours, old man." The threat was clear, and it pushed Ashford past his breaking point. His grandfather had told him stories about the Falklands, about pilots like Cooper who had risked everything to protect British forces on those remote islands. These men weren't just veterans, they were heroes, who had earned the right to live their remaining years in peace and dignity. But what truly decided the matter for Ashford was the sight of Cooper's medals. The Distinguished Flying Cross wasn't given out lightly, it was awarded for acts of exceptional courage and skill in aerial combat. The man gasping for breath on the bench wasn't just any old man being bullied. He was a decorated war hero being tortured by criminals. The crowd was growing larger, and the mood was shifting from curiosity to horror as people realized what they were witnessing. Several tourists were now openly filming the confrontation, their phones capturing every moment of Cooper's humiliation and suffering. Danny decided to escalate the situation further. He grabbed Cooper's walking cane and held it like a weapon, pointing it at the elderly man's chest. "You want this back, Grandpa? Maybe I'll use it to beat some sense into you instead." Cooper's eyes, despite being clouded with the desperation of oxygen deprivation, flashed with anger. Even in his weakened state, the fighter pilot's instincts were still there. He had faced down Argentine jets, enemy ground fire, and the terror of ejecting over hostile territory. He wouldn't be intimidated by street thugs, even if they held his life in their hands. "Go to hell," Cooper managed to gasp, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had commanded respect in the cockpit. And on the ground, this defiance enraged Greg, who raised his fist as if to strike the helpless veteran. "You've got some mouth on you for a dying old man. Let's see how tough you are when you can't breathe at all." It was at this moment that Ashford made his decision. The ceremonial duties of a royal guard were important, but they were not more important than human life. The oath he had taken as a soldier was to protect the innocent and defend those who couldn't defend themselves. Cooper had served his country with honor, and now it was time for his country to serve him. The distance between Ashford's post and the confrontation was approximately 50 meters. In his ceremonial uniform, with his rifle at port arms, he looked like a figure from a painting still, dignified and utterly motionless. But beneath that ceremonial exterior was a soldier who had been trained for combat, who had faced enemy fire in Afghanistan, and who understood that sometimes the greatest duty required breaking the rules. Ashford began to move, not with the measured steps of a ceremonial guard, but with the fluid, deadly grace of a combat veteran. His movements were so smooth and controlled that at first, the crowd didn't even notice he was approaching. He covered the distance in seconds, his rifle held at the ready, his eyes fixed on Greg's raised fist. The first sign that something had changed was when Cooper's attacker suddenly found himself looking down the barrel of an SA-80 assault rifle. The weapon appeared between him and Cooper so quickly that Greg didn't have time to react. One moment he was about to strike a helpless old man, the next he was staring into the cold, professional gaze of a soldier who had killed before and wouldn't hesitate to do so again if necessary. "Step away from the veteran." Now Ashford's voice was quiet, controlled, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. His rifle wasn't pointed directly at Greg, but the threat was implicit and crystal clear. Greg's bravado evaporated instantly. He had been expecting to intimidate a helpless old man, not to find himself confronting a professional soldier who outweighed him by 30 pounds of muscle and had the training to end his life. In seconds, his hand, which had been raised to strike Cooper, began to tremble. "You can't do this," Greg stammered, his voice cracking with fear. "You're not allowed to leave your post. This isn't your business." Ashford's expression didn't change. "I'm making it my business. The inhaler, give it to him." Now Danny, who had been watching the confrontation with growing alarm, still held Cooper's medication. His survival instincts were screaming at him to run, but his legs seemed frozen in place. The Royal Guard's presence was overwhelming, like standing next to a loaded weapon that could explode at any moment. Cooper, meanwhile, was barely conscious. His lips were now distinctly blue, and his breathing was so labored that each breath sounded like a death rattle. He needed his medication immediately, or he would collapse completely. "I said now," Ashford repeated, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. He took a step closer to Danny, who was still holding the inhaler. The crowd had grown silent, sensing the shift in the situation. What had begun as a cruel prank had become something much more serious. The tourists were no longer just casual observers, they were witnesses to a confrontation that could turn deadly in an instant. Danny looked at Greg, hoping for some sign of what to do, but his partner in crime was focused entirely on the rifle that was now less than 3 feet from his chest. The decorated soldier holding that weapon wasn't playing games, and both young men suddenly realized that they had picked the wrong target on the wrong day. Okay, Danny said, his voice high with panic. "Here, take it." He tossed the inhaler toward Cooper, but his hands were shaking so badly that it fell short, landing on the pavement several feet away. Ashford's jaw tightened. The inhaler was crucial, but Cooper was too weak to retrieve it himself. Without taking his eyes off the two thugs, Ashford used his foot to kick the device within Cooper's reach. Cooper's hands trembled as he grasped the inhaler. It took 3 attempts before he could coordinate his movements enough to activate it. and draw the medication into his lungs. The first dose provided immediate relief, loosening the constriction in his airways enough to allow him to take deeper breaths. The second dose began to restore some color to his lips. By the third dose, his breathing was approaching normal, though he remained weak and shaken. "Thank you," Cooper whispered, his voice hoarse but audible. He looked up at Ashford with gratitude and recognition, one soldier acknowledging another's courage. Ashford nodded briefly, but kept his attention focused on Greg and Danny. Both men were now trying to edge away from the confrontation, but the soldier's presence seemed to create an invisible barrier around them. "Where do you think you're going?" Ashford asked, his voice carrying the same quiet authority. "We weren't doing anything wrong," Greg protested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just having a bit of fun with the old man." "Fun?" Ashford's tone could have frozen water. "You call denying medication to a veteran having an asthma attack fun? You call threatening to beat an elderly man fun?" The crowd was now actively filming the confrontation, and several people had called the police. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing closer with each passing second. Cooper, still breathing heavily, but no longer in immediate danger, struggled to his feet. Despite his ordeal, he stood as straight as his condition would allow, his military bearing evident even in his weakened state. "Squadron Leader Jonathan Cooper, Royal Air Force, retired," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "Falklands, 1982. Shut down over Goose Green, May 21st. Ashford's expression softened slightly. "Corporal James Ashford, Grenadier Guards, Afghanistan, 2018 and 2020. The exchange was brief, but it carried the weight of shared experience and mutual respect. Both men had served their country in combat, had faced enemy fire, and had earned the right to call themselves soldiers. Greg, sensing that the situation was slipping further out of his control, made a desperate attempt to justify his actions. He was just sitting there, looking pathetic. "We were just messing around." "Messing around?" Cooper's voice was stronger now, fueled by anger and indignation. "You stole my medication during a medical emergency. You threatened to beat me with my own walking cane. That's not messing around, that's assault and theft." The police arrived in force, 3 patrol cars and a sergeant who took one look at the scene and immediately understood the seriousness of the situation. The sight of a Royal Guard standing over to suspects while protecting an elderly veteran told a story that needed no explanation. "Corporal Ashford," the police sergeant said, recognizing the guard from previous interactions. "What's the situation here?" Ashford maintained his professional composure as he explained the events. "These 2 individuals assaulted this veteran, stole his medication during a medical emergency, and threatened him with his own walking cane. The victim is Squadron Leader Cooper, Royal Air Force, retired." The sergeant's expression darkened as he listened to the account. Assault on an elderly person was a serious crime in itself, but interfering with someone's medical treatment elevated it to a potentially life-threatening offense. "Is this true?" the sergeant asked Cooper, who was now sitting on the bench but breathing normally. Cooper nodded, still holding his inhaler. "They took my medication while I was having an asthma attack. I could have died if the corporal hadn't intervened." The sergeant turned to Greg and Danny, who were trying to blend into the crowd. "You two, stay where you are. You're under arrest for assault, theft, and endangering life." Greg made one last attempt to escape responsibility. "We didn't know he was having a medical emergency. We thought he was just some old drunk or something." "You thought wrong," the sergeant replied curtly. "Even if he had been drunk, that wouldn't justify stealing his property or threatening him." As the police began processing the arrests, the crowd started to disperse, but many people remained to ensure that Cooper was all right. Several tourists approached to offer assistance, and a few asked if they could help him get home safely. Cooper declined their offers politely, but was clearly moved by their concern. "Thank you all for caring," he said. "It's good to know there are still decent people in the world." The incident had taken on a life of its own. As videos of the confrontation began circulating on social media, the sight of a Royal Guard abandoning his post to protect an elderly veteran resonated with people around the world, becoming a symbol of honor and duty that transcended national boundaries. As the immediate crisis passed, the implications of Ashford's actions began to sink in. He had abandoned his ceremonial post, potentially violated military regulations, and used his position to intervene in a civilian matter. While his actions had undoubtedly saved Cooper's life, they could also result in disciplinary action or even the end of his career. The commanding officer of the Royal Guard arrived on the scene within minutes of being notified. Major Richardson was a career soldier who understood both the importance of military discipline and the higher calling of protecting the innocent. Corporal Ashford, Major Richardson said, his voice neutral but carrying the weight of authority. Report. Ashford snapped to attention and provided a concise account of the incident. He didn't attempt to justify his actions or minimize the breach of protocol. He simply stated the facts and accepted responsibility for his decisions. Major Richardson listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When Ashford finished his report, the major turned to Cooper. Squadron Leader Cooper, would you be willing to provide a statement about what happened here? Cooper stood as straight as his condition would allow. Certainly, Sir. Corporal Ashford saved my life. I was having a severe asthma attack, and those two criminals stole my medication. If the corporal hadn't intervened, I would have died. The major nodded thoughtfully. And you're certain about the severity of your condition? I've been managing asthma for over 40 years, sir. I know when I'm in danger, and I was in serious danger today. As the major considered the situation, more details about Greg and Danny began to emerge. Both men had extensive criminal records that included assault, theft, and harassment. Danny had been arrested 3 times in the past year for targeting elderly victims, while Greg had a history of violence that included several bar fights and a conviction for assault with a deadly weapon. The discovery of their criminal backgrounds transformed the narrative from a simple case of harassment to a pattern of predatory behavior that had finally been stopped by a soldier who refused to stand by while a veteran was tortured. Media representatives began arriving on the scene, drawn by the social media coverage and the dramatic nature of the story. The image of a royal guard protecting an elderly veteran struck a chord with the public, becoming a symbol of the values that the military was supposed to represent. The aftermath of the incident unfolded over the following days and weeks. Greg and Danny were charged with assault, theft, and endangering life. Their previous criminal records ensured that they would face serious prison time if convicted. The evidence was overwhelming: multiple witnesses, video recordings, and the testimony of both Cooper and Ashford. Cooper made a full recovery from his asthma attack, though the psychological trauma of the incident would take longer to heal. The knowledge that he had been targeted because of his age and perceived vulnerability was difficult to accept, but the support he received from the public helped restore his faith in humanity. Ashford faced an internal military investigation into his actions. While some argued that he had violated protocol by abandoning his post, the overwhelming consensus was that he had acted in the finest traditions of military service. The phrase duty, honor, country took on new meaning when applied to a soldier who had risked his career to save a life. The investigation concluded that Ashford had acted appropriately under the circumstances. The threat to Cooper's life was immediate and serious, and no other help was available in time to prevent a tragedy. Rather than facing disciplinary action, Ashford was commended for his quick thinking and moral courage. The incident had broader implications for veteran support services in the UK. Cooper's experience highlighted the vulnerability of elderly veterans, who often found themselves targets for criminals who saw them as easy prey. The public outcry following the incident led to increased funding for veteran support programs and better training for police officers in recognizing and responding to crimes against elderly victims. The story became a powerful reminder that military service creates bonds that transcend rank, unit, and generation. Ashford and Cooper had served in different wars, in different branches of the military, but they shared the common experience of putting their lives on the line for their country. When Cooper needed help, that shared bond motivated Ashford to act, regardless of the personal consequences. In the end, the incident at Buckingham Palace became more than just a news story. It became a testament to the enduring values of military service: courage, honor, and the willingness to sacrifice for others. Ashford's actions reminded the world that true soldiers never stop being soldiers, whether they're fighting in Afghanistan or standing guard at a palace, and that the greatest duty is not to protocol or regulation, but to protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The final image that stayed with everyone who witnessed the incident was of 2 soldiers, one young, one old, one active, one retired, standing together in mutual respect and recognition of their shared commitment to something greater than themselves. It was a reminder that honor is not just a word, but a way of life that demands action when others are in need.